Welcome to Words Do Things, a podcast about the powers and limits of language. I'm Dr. Sørina Higgins, and I'm interested in the ways words make things happen. Join me as my guests and I explore language that is helpful, harmful, magical, or masterful, and learn how to wield words beautifully yourself. Hi, thanks for coming back. This is the penultimate rerun episode of 1619 and 1776. So just one more, and then there will be all new content for you. This is a repeat of my interview with Pastor Tom Bridgman that originally aired on November 8th, 2023. As usual, it's audio only, but future episodes will have video options for you as well. So please enjoy this and the last episode, and then come back again next week for brand new material on the current usage of rhetoric in 2025 and beyond. Thanks. Welcome to 1619 and 1776, a podcast exploring the common ground between American Christians on the left and the right. In each episode, I listen to pastors, priests, ministers, and preachers talk about what they see as the core of our faith, what the last few years have been like for them, and how we can come together in unity throughout the church today. Join me while we build bridges across the chasms that divide us. Well, good morning, Pastor Tom Bridgman. It's a very great pleasure to talk with you on the podcast today.
Well, thank you, Sørina, and I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity for doing this.
Well, as we get started here, what if you just tell my listeners a little bit about you and your congregation, maybe just the denomination and what kind of a tradition that comes from, and maybe the demographic of your church there in Massachusetts.
All right, sure. Okay. I'm the pastor of Grace Church Congregational in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, Western Massachusetts, in Berkshire County. And I've been here for 27 years, although it's also the church where my wife and I both grew up. And after having been away for 17 years, we took a call to come back to Pittsfield 27 years ago. And Grace Church is a part of the Conservative Congregational Christian Conference. And the Four C's is a broadly evangelical, founded originally on perhaps a little more reformed foundation, but it is largely broadly evangelical today. And so that gives a little bit of an idea. Grace Church is quite small as a congregation, but such is the case with many New England churches, but we're lean toward a decidedly reformed theology here, historic congregational theology. Some people would say we're really Presbyterian and congregational clothes, but historic
Yes.
and Congregationalism they were pretty much locked at the hip. So anyway.
Okay. Now, when I began this series, I had a whole set of questions about the specific divisions that I saw plaguing the churches that I was connected with at the time. Some of them are still the same, but I think some of them have maybe evolved over the last couple of years.
Sure.
What does it look like from where you are and from your experience? What are some of the big difficulties facing the American church at large or your specific people that you minister?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I think the biggest challenge that we face here, living in New England, of course, has to do with a theologically liberal a context in which we live. This is a very unchurched area. And so in contrast to, say, the South or the Midwest or other parts of the country, the evangelical church is not as strong here. But be that as it may, I believe that gives us more of a platform because it creates a distinction between us and the community, gives us an opportunity for the gospel. In terms of the country as a whole, and I know you're going to be leaning more in the direction of some of the social conflict and political conflict that we've experienced. And I don't know if you want me to hold on responding to those questions at this point, or you want to do it?
Yeah, we'll probably get into those individually. Sure. Before we get into them, could you define a couple of terms for us? I'd love to know what you think evangelical means right now, and maybe liberal. And while we're at it, why not even tell us what the gospel is? And side note, could you really lean in? It's barely catching your voice now.
Okay, sure.
Yeah,
okay.
Thank you.
Well, of course, the gospel revolves around the person and work of Jesus Christ. That we believe that Jesus Christ, the historic gospel is that Jesus is indeed the very Son of God, that he came and gave his life as an atonement for our sin. And as the Apostle Peter says in his address in the 4th chapter of Acts, that there is no other name under heaven given to man by which we must be saved. And so that means that there is an exclusivity to the Christian faith, to the gospel. And what has happened, of course, over the years, and we saw this especially in early congregational churches in New England, is that there was a movement toward Unitarianism and toward universalism. And that has infected, to a large degree, much of the church, especially here in this area in New England, but also all across the country. And so what that means is that there is a difference, the way some people interpret the Christian faith and interpret the Bible. And we believe that the Bible, of course, is inspired by God, that it is authoritative, that it is truly God's word given to us, and therefore true in all of its parts. And so I think that's essential for us. And so what we find, of course, and that would be the difference. The challenge is that when we talk about liberalism and conservative and all of these terms, I remember years ago, the former roommate from my wife's former roommate in college, her father was a Baptist minister, but he was from the more liberal end of the spectrum. And she asked me the question, "Are you a fundamentalist?" This is when I was first married, and my wife and I have been married for over 46 years now. And I said, well, tell me what that means. Fundamentalism mean. Because what it meant in a century ago is not necessarily what it meant a generation later, or certainly not today. And so oftentimes these words that we take as labels will take on pejorative connotations. And this is a concern. And so a generation ago, people would say, "Oh, I'm not a fundamentalist, but I'm an evangelical," which means I'm more broadly minded. And I don't associate with certain organizations that would call themselves fundamentalist or separatist fundamentalist or what have you. And there are groups still to this day that are like that. And but what we find is that there are those that will seek to define even the word evangelical and associate it with right-wing politics and things such as that nature. And I think it's incumbent upon us as Christians to ask that question: what does that mean? What does it mean? Define the term. How are you trying to label me? You see?
Right.
So what it means for me is that we believe the historic gospel. But that's what fundamentalism meant in the early days. We believe the historic gospel is true, and we don't deviate from those things. And that is essential. And that is the bottom line for us as Christians.
Yes, I agree about the words changing over time. I mean, I myself am now scared off of the word evangelical because of the associations and the connotations that it brings up for many of my friends and colleagues and associates. Whereas the word liberal itself is a beautiful word. It means generous, open-handed, freely giving.
Yes,
So,
right.
Yes, I see these words changing, and I myself am very perplexed about what terminology to use when I'm asked about my religious or faith tradition and background. Yes. Well, you've alluded to some specific social issues, And of course, the pandemic was a very divisive event for many people. What was it like for you and your church? Was that a very big challenge for you? Did you have to make compromises? Did you lose members over the pandemic and its responses?
No, we didn't really lose members, Sørina. I mean, it was a challenge for everybody just because we all had to wear masks and we had to go into social distancing. And of course, this made it complicated, but we made it work here in our congregation. We're small enough. And early on, I stood in the pulpit and told the congregation, this is before they had even come out with a vaccine. They were still working on a vaccine, and they had some that they were testing. They were running clinical trials. And I've had the privilege for over 25 years to serve on the institutional review board at our local hospital. And so I've seen a lot of clinical trials come down the pike. And I said, I want you folks to know that I've volunteered to be to participate in a clinical trial. And if they need me to receive a shot, I'm more than willing to roll up my sleeve and do it. And so when they didn't need me, the quota had been filled for people in my category. And so I wasn't a guinea pig. I jokingly told people that I might look like I stepped off the set of Planet of the Apes or something. Anyway, it didn't happen. And but I wanted the congregation to know that I was willing to do that personally, but I wasn't asking anybody else. Not a member of my family, not my wife, not my children, and not the members of the congregation. We had members have members of the congregation that they were resistant to getting a vaccine. And so they didn't. And my wife and I, along with my mother-in-law, who is elderly, we, as soon as we were eligible and able to get a vaccine, we did. And we got through both vaccines and then a booster. And haven't taken another one since. We haven't felt the urgency, but I think a lot of people are in that category, and it's not a pressing issue right now.
Right.
Probably will at some point, but we'll leave that, for the future.
Sure.
And, so it didn't really impact. We didn't have any cases of COVID in our congregation for 2 years.
Wow.
And then all of a sudden the dominoes started falling, and we went boom, 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 and almost, I would say a vast majority of our people have somehow or other ended up with a case of COVID. Yeah. All of those who weren't vaccinated all got COVID. But the first one was someone who had just received his booster a few days before, and then he got COVID.
Oh dear!
The sickest of anybody in the congregation. So no fatalities. But we've made it work, and it hasn't created unnecessary conflict.
Good.
But I prayed that it wouldn't.
Right. Well, and then along with this event that, none of us have control over, this pandemic, this act of God, we also have the varying social responses. And at the same time, and maybe not unrelated, we had the Black Lives Matter movement heating up, right? And there were specific catalysts for that. Yes. Now, I don't hear that rhetoric quite as hot in the churches right now, either the positive encouragement to get involved or the conflicts over it. But what are your thoughts about the things that have happened over racial reconciliation in America over the last 2 years, and how has that affected you and your family and your church, if you want to share?
Okay. Well, that's a big issue for me. I sent you, of course, my biography, a piece of my biography.
Thank you so much. If you want to share any of that with the listeners, they'd be glad to hear it, I'm sure.
I'd be happy to. I was born, of course, in 1950, so you can calculate my age, and in Greensboro, North Carolina, in a hospital within walking distance of the Woolworths, where the civil rights movement was front and center there for a while. And all of my mom's relatives have all lived in central North Carolina. My dad, on the other hand, he was brought up on the mission field. He's an MK, grew up in China and prior to the Communist Revolution and so forth. And so he always had a more global perspective. But my grandfather was essentially, he was raised in South Carolina. And so he served with the Southern Presbyterian Church. That said, as you know, Sørina, my wife and I have an interracial marriage. She is of Jamaican descent. And we have known each other since childhood. She was 9 and I was 12. She jokingly tells people that I robbed the cradle. And her parents her family attended this church that Charlene and I now serve in. And her father and my father were both elders in this church together. And her father was my Sunday school teacher when I was in junior high school. And he still let me marry his daughter. Her older brother and I grew up together. And she is of Jamaican descent. Her parents are both from Jamaica. And so how did that happen? Well, I mean, God's providence, and I have never questioned the blessing that our marriage has been, and my wife feels the same way. And so when we see the civil rights stuff come down the pike, I mean, when I was a kid, I spent time living in North Carolina, about a year and a half, and I attended, the schools were segregated in those days.
Yes.
My son, who is biracial, of course, was really surprised to hear that. Dad, you attended segregated schools when you were in elementary school? And I said, I did, son. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I mean, how do you sort that out when you're 11 years old?
Right.
You don't. You just process these things in your mind over the course of years. Then, of course, it was when I was in high school, junior high and high school, and shortly thereafter, that all of the civil rights movement began coming down the pike. Interestingly enough, as I told you, it was my mom, who was raised in North Carolina, that recommended, right after I got out of the Army during the Vietnam War, that I ask my wife to go on a date. And so she had no aversion.
Right.
Now, for her, it wasn't because of she was trying to make a social statement. It's just that she knew my in-laws, knew the family, knew that they were believers, and felt that that Charlene Crawford would be someone that would be good for her son. Anyway, so I leave it there. But the whole dynamic of the social rights movement has been through a lot of change over the past couple generations, since the 1960s and prior to that. And so we still see the manifestation of it. When I saw, of course, and I think many people did, when they saw the footage of George Floyd with a policeman with his knee on his neck, I mean, it was very painful. And you have, ideally, and I think many of us, I don't know what percentage, many of us would have thought, my goodness, if I had been there, I would have wanted to rush in and say, you got to stop. You got to get your knee off that man's neck because you're killing him. And what if he's guilty of a crime, it doesn't deserve killing him in this fashion. And so it was very painful, and inevitably it was going to create a lot of upheaval.
Right.
And so I saw this happen, and we saw it happen as a nation, just as we saw other things, the incident out in California, I'm trying to remember, a Rodney King issue and all that kind of stuff. You go, you're creating a crisis that doesn't need to be here. And let's not do this, And so those types of things trigger something. They should trigger something in us as Christians. We should have a reaction to those things. But one of the things that I have tried to point out to people all along is that, here my wife and I have been married for over 46 years. And for us, our primary identity does not lie in our racial makeup, but it lies in our faith. And we were interviewed many years ago, over 30 years ago, by a local newspaper when we lived in Ohio. And because they were interviewing those that had interracial marriages. And the point that we both wanted to make, and we had our picture in the paper and everything, is that our identity is in our being disciples of Jesus Christ, first and foremost. And so who we are as a couple, the racial background of who we are is really secondary to that. Does it mean that it has no impact? Well, it does. But people will sometimes ask me the question, have you ever experienced any difficulty? Or ask my wife, have you ever experienced any difficulty because of your race? We know that there has been some people that somehow or other looked on us with disapproval. But for us, it hasn't really impacted us because we're not looking for a demon under every doily.
That's a good phrase.
And
So, yeah, I have two questions about that, if I could.
Yeah, go ahead, Sørina.
First of all, I know, being brought up in the segregated schools, and you also mentioned to me that there would be a division between the hired help that was white and the hired help that was people of color.
Yes.
So I'm wondering whether your perhaps older Southern relatives presented any resistance. Did you have any people that you knew came from slaveholding ancestry? Did you have any people who had prejudice that they expressed towards you and Charlene in the early years?
Yeah, in terms of my ancestry, Sørina, I had asked my mom, and my mom said, well, no, she didn't know of any. And I can trace, actually, on my mom's side, I can trace my ancestry back about 6 generations, believe it or not. And if I go back, all the way back about 6 generations, believe it or not, one of my ancestors was actually an English Jew that came over and settled in North Carolina.
Oh, wow.
And his son became a Methodist circuit rider. So either he was converted or his son was converted. This was prior to the Civil War, okay? And then on another branch of the family, there was one who was the postmaster of Chatham County, and he was actually fired from his position as postmaster of Chatham County, North Carolina, because he was committed to the abolition of slavery prior to the Civil War.
Wow, that's intense.
But that's all I knew. Yep. I didn't know anything else. But, there's a dynamic in the culture that, and there always is, no matter what culture we live in, whether we live in New England or whether we live in China or whether we live in Mississippi or Alabama, there's a dynamic culture. And so people tend to interpret that which is, I think probably many people say, don't rock the boat. This is the way things are, and we want things to remain peaceful. And so in my mom's side of the family, there were those that, and one great aunt who was almost like a grandmother to me, when she found out that Charlene and I were serious about one another and were thinking about getting married, she was a devout Methodist, and she wanted her faith to be front and center for her. And so her question was, well, what about the children? Will this cause problem for your children? And I explained to her that my wife's background, her father was an engineer, and which was another challenge in and of itself when he first became an engineer, which I won't go into. But those types of things, and that he was an elder in our church and one of the most disciplined and most godly men that I have ever met. And so I do feel that I have the highest respect, and everybody that has ever known him has seen him in that same light.
Yes.
and which is very true. And so I communicated that to my great aunt, and my wife was in college at the time. She was actually quite academic, and she was in what I call one of the mini Ivies, okay, and was thinking at that point in time about the possibility of medical school. And because she was a good student, she was a biopsych major, and she probably could have gotten the end quite readily if she had chosen to pursue that route. And I explained that to my aunt, and her comment was, "Well, I guess that'll be all right, you know." And so, and then she attended our wedding. She came up with us, attended our wedding, and it was her way of saying, "I support you."
Oh, that's lovely.
And so, but you know, they were not people that were activists.
Right.
My family members were not activists. They were very quiet, very methodical, and very disciplined. They were farmers, and for the most part, although my aunt was a school teacher. But anyway, that gives you a little bit. And
it does.
So I can't recollect any overt opposition. Was there some talk behind our back? I don't know, possibly. But you know, sometimes you don't worry about those things, Sørina.
Thank you.
Who had grown up in the South, I'm making a short story long for you. Okay. He had graduated, he's one of my dad's side, one that was a missionary with the Southern Presbyterian Church, and he had gone to college at the Citadel in South Carolina, and then went to seminary. And when I asked him, this is long after his retirement, about a year or two before he died, and when I was thinking about seminary, and he recommended several seminaries, all three of them were decidedly reformed, and he mentioned one in Mississippi, and which I knew had a very good student aid package. And I thought, well, I asked him the question, well, you know, do you think that would be a problem for my wife and me, given the climate there? And Grandpa was always very quiet. He was kind of your classic gray flannel Presbyterian, okay? And he made a statement that I knew meant more than what he said with his words. And he says, well, I'm sure they have air conditioning in the student housing now.
Understatement of the century.
Tom, you do what God calls you to do. If God calls you to go to seminary in Mississippi, then that's what you do, and you don't sweat the small stuff. And for him, dealing with the implications. Now, if we ran into issues, if I had gone to school there, and if we ran into issues there, it wouldn't have seemed like small stuff to us. But he had lived through stuff in China that people would say, wow, that is big. And it was his way of saying, Tom, the Christian life demands something from us. And so that was his only comment, and he refused to say any more about it. So that was his way of communicating that. Plus, he served two very small churches after he came back from China, and I know it was a challenge for him because it was during the Jim Crow era, and for him, the churches that he was serving, probably couldn't even find China on the map. For Chinese people, boy, they're different from us, you know?
Right.
But you're going to find that anywhere you go. Yeah. You're going to find it in Mississippi, you're going to find it in Louisiana, you're going to find it in South Carolina, you're going to find it in Vermont or upstate New York, or wherever you go, you're going to have people that go, well, this is, like my son was born in Vermont. And there were people who said, oh, you got to be here 3 generations before you're a Vermonter. Just because a cat has kittens in the oven doesn't make them muffins, you know?
Oh, that's quite a saying. Could I Could I bring it back to something you said a couple of minutes ago about
Yes,
your identity, you and Charlene, and your marriage? I remember when you wrote up that bio for me, you mentioned that right from the beginning, you decided that your identity as a couple would not be, we are an interracial couple, but we are a Christian couple. And I'd love to hear you dig into that more, but if you don't mind, I'll give a little observation first.
Go ahead, sure.
I mean, I've known you and Charlene my whole life. You've known me since before since before I existed, having gone to school with my parents. And I am very grateful for two things I'll mention here. First, that my parents, when they were in seminary, lived in the International House.
Sure.
So I was the only American baby there. There were a couple of other white babies, but one was Canadian and one was French. And then the others were from Africa and India and various parts of the world. So it was a really beautiful intercultural little community there. Now, I was too young to remember that, but my mother has always regaled us with stories of those times. And then growing up in your church and knowing you and Charlene from a very early age, I'm very grateful for my earliest impressions not being of cultural division, but of being cultural unity and harmony. Because obviously when you're a baby and you're born into a church where the pastor and his wife have an interracial marriage, you don't stop and analyze that. It's just natural. It's what you're born into. And I'm really glad that that was my first impression rather than later on, you know, as a kid having questions about, well, how does this work out? So all that said, could you dig in a little bit more to what does that mean? Your identity is as a Christian couple first. How do you conceptualize that, and how does it work out on a practical basis?
On a practical basis, I think, Sørina, there's several things that I often feel burdened about, and I've run into this, I think, probably everywhere that we have been. And it's certainly present here in Western Massachusetts. It was in Vermont, and certainly you're going to find it in the South. And that is this, what I call a provincial spirit. And that is that somehow or other that which we are familiar with is the way things should be, you see. And so I think to a large degree, I have wrestled with the question, okay, why has there been such a reaction in the past? Why was for example, the Ku Klux Klan formed? Why was there a reaction to the races and feeling the need, for example, to keep one race suppressed? And why did that happen? What is the motive behind that? And what can make the difference? And I'm fully convinced that the answer really lies in the gospel. That Jesus, you know, I made reference to that verse where the Christians there in Jerusalem on the day that Jesus ascended said, "Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel?" And the point that I sought to make, and that I'm fully convinced of, is that they were thinking in terms of political and eschatological terms. Okay, now you have risen from the grave and you performed all these miracles, and now you're going to set up this kingdom here in the nation of Israel. And Jesus says, no, it's not for you to know that answer. Basically, I think he was saying is that one question, but you'll receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, and Samaria, and to the uttermost parts of the earth. And there were a couple of things. Jesus progressively got further and further away. When he crossed the line into Samaria, oh no, because the Jewish reaction to the Samaritans, they looked down upon them, but going to the uttermost parts of the earth where there were Gentiles, that wasn't kosher, you know. And of course, the Apostle Paul here was one who defended his ministry to the Gentiles in the gospel amongst the Gentiles in Acts chapter 15 in the book of Galatians so vehemently. He said, no, and here he was the one who was the most Jewish of all of them. Mm-hmm. And so what it requires of us, and I think this is why I mentioned my grandfather and why I mentioned my father, is that they grew up on the mission field. And so the Great Commission, are we thinking missionally? Are we thinking about the Great Commission? And so when I think about, for example, dealing with people, for example, okay, going into the hood, where it is primarily African American, where it is going to be Latino or what have you. Okay, how do I communicate? What is my goal? What is my intention here? You see, to say, oh no, you people need to change. You aren't like us. You don't fit our cultural context. And the fact of the matter is that when we think missionally, we need to sort out the difference between what the gospel really is and what God is calling us to do as Christians, as disciples of Jesus Christ, and what seems comfortable to us in our particular immediate context, you see, in our life.
Yeah.
So I think this is part and parcel. And so, you would ask the question, what does it mean? What is essential for the Christian faith, to be a Christian? One is, of course, to believe and to trust in Jesus Christ and Him alone for our salvation, but also to be as salt and light in our environment, to be witnesses in our environment, no matter where we are. Mm-hmm. If we're called to China, or if we're called to the Bronx, you see, or if we're called to Mississippi,
or a little town in Massachusetts,
or a small town, Massachusetts. Yeah. Right. Who would have
thought? Well, so that leads me to what maybe we'll do these last two questions because they're pretty big.
Okay,
so
sure.
The first one is going to be a why or how question, like you were just asking. And then the last is going to be a question about moving towards unity. What can we do?
Yeah.
So the how or why is, you were just asking the excellent questions. Why would something like the Ku Klux Klan arise? Why would we feel the need to oppress people of one particular ethnic background? So I am asking a similar question right now about the church, and in particular about churches like yours, because that's my own tradition.
Yes. Right.
And here's the question. Why are we divided over these issues? Why do I have one pastor saying, if you are a Christian, that automatically means that you will act out God's love specifically to overthrow systems of power and oppression, and you will get involved in racial justice because Jesus comes to serve the marginalized? And then I have another pastor saying, if you are a Christian, you will not focus on race as identity. So if you get involved in something like the Black Lives Matter movement, you are not a Christian because you're focusing on works instead of on gospel. How can I have two people who believe the same Bible, who believe the same creeds, who even hold the same, for instance, Westminster Confession? They've got all the same head knowledge. How can they be saying the exact opposite thing and hating each other and saying each other are not Christians over one of the big social issues of our times? What can you help me out with that?
Well, a couple of things, Sørina. One is, as Christians, when we deal with these types of things, and this is something that we have seen, I think, especially over these past few years, just everything that has come down the pike, and ask ourselves the question, what are we trying to protect? What are we trying to protect? Are we trying to protect? Do we have a standard that we're trying to protect? And is that within our purview? Okay. And I'm not entirely convinced that it is, because the fact of the matter is that we really do live in a pluralistic environment. And the United States is changing. Yes, I believe that there was much more Christian influence, but sometimes I think we believe that there was more Christian influence there certainly was with the Puritans when they came, and the Pilgrims were committed believers, the Puritan vision to establish a city on a hill, and all of that type of stuff, and that they would be a manifestation of God's covenant blessing on us as a nation. And yet that wasn't to be. And so things fell apart fairly early on. And so the question is, how is it that this influence, this Unitarian influence, came in from Europe and infected the Congregational Church so dramatically, but not just the Congregational Church, but began to infiltrate and impact the churches throughout New England and all of the 13 colonies? I'm convinced that the Great Awakening had a tremendous impact on the type of, and I think many Christians do if they've studied it, that were it not for the Great Awakening and what God did to restore the a spiritual commitment in the 1730s and the 1740s, that the American Revolution probably would have been dramatically different. It may have resembled, in some respects, more the French Revolution. And completely, well, I'm speculating, and so I can only say so much about that. But the fact of the matter is that I believe that there's a lot of truth to that God in his providence did something. And so periodically in the life of our nation, and so I hold out hope that we will experience a real spiritual awakening, a spiritual renewal in the United States of America. And if we don't, then we'll have to recognize, we realize that American history is much shorter than European history, and certainly much shorter than the histories of the Middle East, of Egypt, of Israel, of China, and many other locations in the world, okay? And so if we look at it through too narrow a lens, we need to recognize that God, and so what is our calling in the midst of this? And the other thing is that in order to address it as believers, I think one within the context of the church among fellow believers is we need to learn how to communicate. We need to learn how to speak a common language and decide what our real priorities really are. Are we trying to restore a cultural dynamic? Is this what's driving us? And how do we accomplish that? How do we, for example, my wife and I are both fervently committed to the sanctity of life. And so we believe very strongly in that every unborn child is created in the image of God and deserves to live. At the same time, of course, we believe that the fact that we're created in the image of God impacts all races as well. And so that's what should drive our view, our understanding of how we relate to one another. We're also burdened, we're fervently committed to a biblical ethic with regard to sexuality and stuff like that, and all the changes that we have seen come down the pike just within the past couple of decades have been really unsettling. The same-sex marriage, the whole transgender business and stuff like that. And we see this as evidence of a moral decline in our nation. But the question is that if our nation is largely non-Christian and not following Jesus Christ, what impetus do they have to live by a Christian ethic? You see what I mean?
So do I hear you saying that the churches who are divided over these issues do not have a long enough, broad enough historical perspective? Or do I hear you saying that churches who think a certain way have given in to a non-Christian moral ethic? I'm not sure which one.
Well, yes, and I think they're both, yeah, and I tried to incorporate too much into that answer to realize that, that God really is sovereign. And I think this coming Sunday is Reformation Sunday, and I'm going to be preaching on the Reformation. That was 500 years ago. What did God do in the church in the Reformation? And are we due for whether it would be a reformation? It's not going to is not going to mirror the Reformation that took place 500 years ago in Germany and all across Europe. But what is God seeking to accomplish in the church today and in the world today? What is God's primary purpose? What's he going to do, and what role do we play within that? And so I think one of the biggest things, one of the most important things is that for us as a church to turn our attention, one, to get our eyes off of the dynamics in the culture and say, okay, what is our calling? What is our calling? If we live, for example, in the Bible Belt, the culture is going to be more inclined toward biblical ethics. If we don't live in the Bible Belt, and we don't here in New England, okay, and in many parts of the Northeast and certainly the Northwest, you go out to Seattle and all that, it's not part of the Bible Belt either. And so there's going to be, I think, probably a greater propensity movement away from biblical ethics. And so can we impose biblical ethics on a non-Christian culture? Where do we start? What is our starting point? And we have to start with the gospel and how we communicate the gospel.
But if I could be a little perverse for a moment, isn't the question exactly what are biblical ethics? Because I go to this church and they say biblical ethics are family values, pro-life, traditional sexuality. I go to this church and they say biblical ethics are fighting against poverty, fighting against racism, trying to bring down systems of oppression. They both passionately believe these are biblical ethics, and yet they fight against each other over both the terminology and the practical application of them. And that's what has me befuddled.
Okay. So the question is, why are we dividing them?
Yes.
Why are we dividing those things?
Right.
And I realize that this requires communication, doesn't it? Within the context of the church, it requires and active communication and a commitment to recognize that we're part of the same body, that we're part of the body of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I recommended a book to you.
Yes, I'm halfway through it and I love it. Yeah.
And I was quite impressed because here I was at a conference that was decidedly reformed, and there was a speaker there who had grown up in the rap culture, African-American man. He's now a pastor in Philadelphia, and his name is Shai Lin. And I heard him speak on 2 occasions, and I thought, you know, his burden and his vision is really, he has articulated a vision that really is quite close to mine. Mm-hmm. And I read his book, and I passed it on. My son read his book, and I thought, you know, he is a believer, and his burden is the same. And yet here he is. He's writing from the African American experience, the hood experience. Okay,
right.
It's not my wife's experience. She grew up in a largely white middle class context. Okay, mm-hmm. And so she can't relate to culturally. She can't relate to the hood. But he grew up in that context, and yet here he is, a believer, and he's saying something that I think is very valuable to us as a church. And I think part of what he is saying is that we need to communicate, not superficially, where we say, and I think this is a problem, because when we communicate superficially, what we're doing is, and anyway, I won't go into there. I'm grasping for words now, Sørina. So.
Right. Well, I'll just tell my listeners the book is The New Reformation. And the subtitle is something like Seeking Hope in the Fight for Ethnic Unity by Shai Lin. And you're right, he has a deep awareness of the rhetoric on various sides of this divide, but he's offering a new perspective that he's deeply sensitive to everyone's backgrounds, but he's not interested in fighting the culture wars or taking a side. He is passionately committed to that unity.
Yes.
So I would love to get him on the podcast in a future season.
Oh, that would be great. If you could do that, I would certainly, I think that would be great, Sørina.
Yeah. Well, I think we're at the end of our time here, but I think you have given me the answer to that last question, which was essentially, where do we go from here as the church? How do we seek that unity? And you said, remembering that we're members of the body of Christ, remembering our priorities. Anything else you want to say about the future? Are you optimistic about that move towards unity?
Well, I am in the long run, in the broad, because I believe, I believe firmly in Jesus' promise that he would build his church and the gates of hell would not prevail against it. And I say this also, too, because I've had some interesting conversations with my son, who is in his 30s. He's in his later 30s now, and is biracial. He loves the city. He loves going in, and he loves he identifies more with his Caribbean ancestry than either my wife or my mother-in-law, who is from Jamaica. And he loves going down to the Caribbean Festival, Labor Day Festival in Brooklyn every year when he's around, stuff like that. But anyway, he has a friend, and I use this as an example, who is completing her PhD at Columbia in New York City. Her house, her apartment has been in Harlem. She is Canadian by nationality, but is of Jamaican ancestry, and they've had lots of conversations, and she came up and spent some time with us in our home. And I said, Ian, what is she doing her dissertation on? And she says, well, it's on intersectionalism, Dad.
Yeah.
I said, and she's not a Christian, or she wasn't when she was up here. And but anyway, and I said, Ian, you've got to help me out. What does that mean? And I wasn't familiar with some of the terminology, critical race theory, and all this kind of stuff. He filled me in on the details, and so he went through, and I said, oh, you mean mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the most victimized of all? And he says, yes, exactly, Dad. And I said, well, okay, what was your response? And he says, Dad, don't you see, this is a real opportunity for the gospel. And I said, how? Tell me how. Because all I saw was the negative side of it. And he said, it's simply the question, well, what is the solution? Oh, there are no solutions, she said. And he said, well, that's where I disagree. And that's why I'm a Christian. Because I believe there is a solution, and the solution is in the gospel of Jesus Christ. And you look at what God has done down through history. You see it played out in the book of Acts. These divisions among different cultures, different nationalities, and so forth, bringing the church together. Does this mean that it will always be easy? Well, it hasn't been down throughout history. And there is a story about Robert E. Lee after the end of the Civil War, after he had signed away the Confederacy there at Appomattox, and he was back in Richmond, Virginia, in his Episcopal church, and they were partaking of communion, and there was a black person or a black family in the back of the church, and they were required to wait until all the whites had taken communion, and then they could go forward and they could take communion too. And he waited, and he went down and knelt beside this black family and took the Lord's Supper. And people said, why did you do that? And he said, the war is over. And I find that deeply moving because, there is conflict, and there will always be conflict, you see, because we live in a fallen world. There will always be conflict. But the question is, what is the solution to that conflict? And it's in the gospel. And for us who follow Jesus, Jesus said, if you're going to follow me, you got to be my disciple and take up your cross and follow me. And you think about, the the early apostles, they were all martyred except for perhaps the apostle John, who died as a prisoner,
Mm-hmm.
And so, this is part of what it means to follow Jesus. What is our calling? What is our calling? Does it mean that all of us called to be activists? My activism is for the gospel, because I believe that's the real heart. That's the real issue. You see what I mean?
Yes.
And so where is my primary focus? And things can get chaotic, and I don't have all the answers by any stretch of the imagination. But I guess I am an optimistic. I am an optimist because of Christ, and perhaps a bit of an idealist too. But be that as it may, I think we need some idealists in the world too, don't we?
All right. I think so too. Well, we'll leave it there on that positive, optimistic, and idealistic note. So thank you very much, Pastor Tom.
You're welcome, Sørina.
Thank you for listening to this episode of 1619 and 1776. If you liked it, please subscribe, leave a review on your favorite podcast app, and pass it along to a friend. This show was artfully produced by Christopher Bartlett. Music was arranged and performed by Chuck Jennings. I'm Sørina Higgins, and I hope you join me next time for another perspective on unity across partisan divides in the church today. Thank you for listening to this episode of Words Do Things. I hope you come back next week for more ideas and discussion. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, like, share, and review. If you have suggestions, you can find me on social media. I'm Dr. Sørina Higgins on most platforms. Thanks to my project coordinator, Sophia Holcomb, to the anonymous musician who provided me with 2 arrangements of Talk Don't Bother Me by Ray Charles, to all my guests and to each of you for joining the conversation. Whatever you say today, remember, words do things. What do you want them to do?